Welcome to Al Bernstein Unplugged Unboxing. In a 40-year Hall of Fame career, Al has chronicled some of the greatest moments in boxing history. On this podcast, you get to hear him expand on those memories and talk about the current news in the sport of boxing. You also hear Al interview some of the biggest names in the sport. Here's Al Bernstein Unplugged.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the show. Glad that you joined us. On this episode, we're going to be taking a look back at some moments that we've had with some of our guests that I think demonstrate kind of what we're about on this show. I think the essence of this show is getting people on here who can tell you interesting stories about things that have happened to them or happened in association with them in the sport of boxing, give you some insights, and I think kind of enlighten you about the sport of boxing and what they've been about. There are lots of shows that concentrate more on specifically making news or having controversy, and we will occasionally do that on this show, but I think the mission statement here is we want you to enjoy the people that you get to see on this show, and we will show you some of those great stories that they had to tell us as we move on with this show. But the other thing that we want to do on this particular one, I've gotten so many questions from you, and we can't always get to all of them. On this show, we're going to try to get to as many as we can, and you send me your questions at Al Bernstein on Twitter, and we're going to share as many of those as we can with you today. And to help me do that, my pal, Trip Mitchell. Hi, Trip.
Al, and our first question we'll get to in just a second, but it has to do with your thoughts on Howard Cosell. Do you think Howard will go down as one of the most controversial announcers in the history of boxing because of his timing and the fact that the 60s and 70s were just such a great time?
Oh, yeah. Well, Howard is a lightning rod, in many, many ways. Because really, and not just in boxing, I think with all the sports that he did, he was the father of some of the things in sportscasting today and in fact, some of the things that this question is going to deal with. He kind of created a certain way of sportscasting that changed the business.
Yeah, and I know you're not a fan of some of the where basically an announcer is bigger than a sport. But Al, in your case, you've always tried to be understated, but Howard was bigger than the sporting events that he covered.
He was for sure. And some of that was good and some of it wasn't.
Well, let's get to the first question. This comes from Killpat. In 1983, you wrote this column in KO. In the wake of Cosell quitting boxing, it would be very interesting to have you revisit your thoughts on the podcast from this column, and we'll read an excerpt here in just a second, with 38 years of experience. And to quote you here, there are enough intriguing questions to be asked. Are we too opinionated? Do we seek to have an input beyond what is appropriate? Should we have any impact at all except to inform and enlighten viewers?
Yeah, that column that I wrote was right after Cosell had left boxing. He decided kind of mid-fight while he was doing the Tex Cobb-Larry Holmes fight that he didn't want to do boxing anymore and literally kind of just stopped doing the broadcast. And Don Chevrier, who I later worked with at ESPN, had to kind of rush in to finish the broadcast, which is pretty extraordinary. I can't imagine that happening today, but it did. And it led me to those questions. Now, think of it, that was 1983. And those questions are ones that I think are reasonable ones to ask about our role as a sportscaster. How quaint when you now look back at me asking those questions in light of what we now see in sportscasting. Do you think, Trip, is anybody asking those questions of themselves right now? Very few.
No, we've got into this culture where, create controversy, do whatever you need to keep people on that channel or whatever digital channel you're on.
Yeah. I mean, And I don't want to be too broad in painting the brush, but what you just said was essentially the case. I don't know if there's a lot of introspection among sportscasters about those questions. And I'll tell you, for me, I think to myself, and I don't know if this is some people might even say this is inappropriate or that I would do this too much, but when I'm broadcasting a fight or I'm reporting on an event or when I'm doing whether it's a podcast like this or a talk show as we do here, or when I did talk radio on All Sports, in the back of my mind always is, if I was the person I'm talking about watching or listening to this show, would I think it's fair? Now, of course, it's hard to know what's fair when people are talking about you if they're being even at all negative. But I think of that, and so like in that story, I asked the question about affecting careers. When you're doing boxing broadcasts, for instance, the perception of how people fought sometimes is just as important as whether they won or lost. And we as sportscasters can affect people's perceptions. So I just think all those questions are ones that you constantly should be asking yourself because, what you do has an impact.
Well, the Will Rogers of the 1980s, Tex Cobb, had a great line, and I'll butcher it a little bit, but he basically said, if I caused Howard to quit doing boxing, maybe I should be a football player, and then he could quit doing football as well.
Yeah, that's right.
I butchered it, but it was a great
thought. Get him out of
thought.
some other sports as well. Well, one of the things about that event too that fascinates me is that, at the beginning, the Tex Cobb Larry Holmes fight was one that, let's be honest, it was not that even a fight. However, Tex Cobb had some important wins that got him the fight with Larry Holmes. It wasn't that he was just some lousy fighter that they threw in there. He had gotten several important wins that made the fight feasible. And at the beginning of the fight, Howard Cosell knew what he was getting as well as during the fight. So I just thought it was a bit disingenuous to all of a sudden stop broadcasting in the middle of a broadcast when you knew at the beginning that this was probably a fight that could have gone in the direction that it went in, with Larry Holmes, controlling things and dominating. And part of the problem with the fight was Larry Holmes was not a huge puncher and Tex Cobb was as tough as nails. So round after round, Holmes was beating him up, but the fight didn't get stopped. So.
Did you ever meet Mr. Cosell in your travels?
Yeah, I was only around Howard Cosell a couple of times, very early in my career, and we never had any major exchanges. I was doing a fight I was with Sal Marciano, and we were doing we went to ABC when I was at ESPN to do to retape a fight that was going to air on ABC shortly after they had bought ESPN. And I came out of the booth with Sal, and there was Howard Cosell, and ironically, Roone Arledge came down, which I thought was interesting. It's the only time I ever met Roone Arledge, and we had a brief exchange, but nothing significant. So, I'm one of those people that, while I recognize the impact that Howard Cosell had on sports, and he was a brilliant man and a larger-than-life figure, I'm one of the people that is not on board with all the trends he started in sportscasting. But there's good and there's bad. You take the good with the bad with everybody.
Well, and a nuanced person by far and away. Let's get to something that's going to be you're going to have an impact on directly, and that's Joe D'Annunzio asked, how do you see the Burchelt-Valdez fight going?
Yeah, that's a fight that will be airing on February 20th. That'll be on ESPN, and the Top Rank folks are putting that one on, and it's a very good fight. Miguel Burchelt and Oscar Valdez, and it's a fight that is one of the fights coming up in the sport of boxing. I think, like our fight in which we had Angelo Leo and Stephen Fulton Jr., and they created a terrific 12-round fight. That's kind of what I think, and we had that one on Showtime. That's kind of what I think this one could be. Oscar Valdez moving up from featherweight to go to super featherweight to take on the champion Miguel Berchelt. For Valdez, a fighter who is very exciting, has some defensive issues. He's been working with Eddie Reynoso, who also trains Canelo Alvarez and trains some other top boxers, to try and fix some of his defensive problems while still allowing him to be aggressive as a fighter. Valdez is the underdog in this fight. He's had some troubles in recent fights, even though he's still undefeated and has never lost. He had his jaw broken against Scott Quigg in a defense of his featherweight title in which he won. And so he comes into the fight a decided underdog, but definitely a live underdog. As for Miguel Berchelt, a 29-year-old who is as exciting as you can possibly be as a fighter. He is involved in wildly exciting fights, and this will be the 7th title defense he'll have of his super featherweight crown. He is one of the people that I think rightfully is thought of as a potential superstar in the sport of boxing. If he can get the right matches and get in against the right people, and they can create some big fights for him, because there are some great fighters down in that around those weight classes. I think he can be very special in the sport in the next several years, and he's going to have all his hands full with Valdez for sure.
Okay, and we got another kind of an inside TV question, but this is very interesting, coming from Devin Johnson. Without throwing anyone under the bus, which, as you've said, is not what we do here, do networks favor biased views / commentary for the house fighter? I've seen it happen on other networks, and I'm curious if this is suggested.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it is one that is often debated and often talked about. I can only speak to my own personal experiences and also offer some thoughts on why it may occur when it seems to occur. First of all, from my own experiences, I can go back to my days at ESPN. On those broadcasts, there wasn't some meeting where you'd sit around and of course, the show that I was on was called Top Rank Boxing, even though they didn't run the show, which was a misnomer. ESPN ran the show, but Top Rank was the promoter that did all the shows. So I didn't work for Top Rank. I didn't work for the promoter, and they didn't run the shows, and they didn't control the editorial content on the show. But nonetheless, it had their name on it. I can honestly say that nobody at the network or anyone related to Top Rank made efforts to influence how we would announce fights. There may have been times when somebody didn't like what I said or thought, gee, I wish you'd have done this or you'd have done that. But honestly, it was never anything that made its way to me or was thought of. At Showtime, where I've been for now many years, I can say the same thing. I've gone through several regimes at Showtime, several men at the top, several groups that have run the sports programming, and I've never had people say to me, "Oh, this is how we should approach this fight, and we should be highlighting this guy more and highlighting that." I know some people will say, will think that that it's naive to even say that to them, but it's a fact. You talk about different things that could happen in the fight. You talk about different people that might end up on that network again, and you talk about them being on that network again, not because you want them to win and be on that network, only because what is possible. Like, what's a fight we might talk about when we get to the end of this fight that is possible? And you don't do it for just one of the fighters. I don't care if there is a quote A side and a B side. You do it for both of the fighters. And one of the things I take pride in for the broadcasts I'm on is we talk about both fighters. We make a conscious effort to talk about both of them. I have never, ever, ever sat down to do a boxing match in which I thought one fighter was more important than the other. Ever. In 40 years. I've never done it. I'm never going to do it. As far as I'm concerned, both fighters are as important. Clearly, sometimes somebody's a huge favorite and they're a big name. I mean, I'm not naive and I'm not blind. But my mission is to make sure that I'm not calling that fight that way. Now, I will tell you how you can tell if somebody has a subconscious or not so subconscious kind of affinity, or you could say a bias or whatever for a fighter. If an announcer keeps referring to one fighter by his first name and the other fighter by his last name, it's simple. I mean, when I hear that, then I know that whether it's subconscious and they don't really know they're doing it, or whether it is conscious, that they are leaning toward that fighter, and that fighter is more in their mind.
Now, Al, I'm going to have to disagree. I was looking back and I saw you calling the Harlem Globetrotters against the Washington Generals.
Yeah, that's true.
And you were all over the Globetrotters.
All right, you know what? I didn't. I was a little more prone to being pro Globetrotter. All right, I got to give you that one. Yeah, but
okay.
but I do like Red Klotz of the. Now that reference I just made is so dated that there's that at least 80% of our audience has no idea who I'm talking about.
It's good to be of a certain age, Al.
Yes. Good sometimes,
okay. Yeah. Okay, we've got some more great questions coming up later in the show.
All right, yeah. Well, for now, let's take a look at some of these video clips that we've put together. As I said, we kind of value on this show people that do good storytelling, and we've put together some clips of some of the folks that you've seen on this show, but we've kind of put them in one spot where you can hear some really fascinating stories. And here's how we did that. Well, a lot of shows that are about boxing specialize in making news. Some of them specialize in having controversy. On this show, we do make news sometimes, and once in a while, we'll have some controversial exchanges. But for the most part, this show is about providing good storytelling and, I hope, insights for you. And so when I selected some moments to look back on for this show, I picked them out with that in mind. And let's start out with something that I think was a fascinating exchange between me and Lennox Lewis, the great heavyweight champion of the world. Lennox told us about his early days of meeting Mike Tyson and what that experience was about.
It all started obviously in 1983 at the World Junior Championships in Santo Domingo, when I actually won the tournament, and the Americans said that, hey, you didn't box the best. And I'm like, who's the best? And they said, it's, Mike Tyson. He doesn't like taking planes. His manager, Customato, doesn't like taking planes. And me and my trainer at the time, we were saying, well, who is this guy, man? We need to find out who this guy is, because a lot of people didn't want to spar me either.
Yeah, so I'm sure.
We found each other in that sense, and me and my trainer, bless his soul, Arnie Beam, elected to drive up there. We drove up there. We met Customato. We stayed at the house. I met Mike, lovely guy, until we got in the ring. That's when the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde came out in Mike. I thought he first courted me and sweetened me up, and then tried to beat me up. So it gave me a lesson as well. It's not where you're from, it's where you're at. So I'm in his territory, so I got to be careful. Yeah. And that was then. And then he went off to do his illustrious pro career, and I was still amateurs at the time, so I was focused on amateurs. He was focused on pro, and I didn't know if we were going to actually meet. But when we were sparring at that time, Customato, in the last round, said, Mike, don't you do that. You're going to face this man one day. And I'm like, that was always ringing in the back of my head. And I wondered if it would ever come true, and it did.
And speaking of Mike Tyson, the man that called so many of Mike Tyson's championship matches in the early days was the great Barry Tompkins, who announced those fights on HBO. And Barry had a very interesting beginning with HBO. He tells us about this story in which a couple of icons nearly came to blows.
Truly, I had never heard of HBO. I didn't know what HBO was. You know, cable television was absolutely in its infancy. And out here on the left coast, there was no cable television. And my very first event for them, they called me a couple weeks after I got back, and they asked me to do an event in Hawaii. And it was a gymnastics event. And then from there, it segued into the, and this is kind of an interesting story too, it segued into the National Collegiate Boxing Championships. They were at the Air Force Academy. And Ray Leonard and I were the not and Don Dunphy and Larry Merchant did the blow-by-blow in color. And they actually got into a fight, and not far from a fist fight.
Wow.
During the broadcast. This is no joke. And Ray and I, we were way out in East Jesus, you know, somewhere. And all you could hear is the rattling of the headphones being thrown down on the counter. And I look over ringside, and they're both standing up, you know, in each other's grill. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, what do we do here, you know? And as it turned out, after that, I replaced Don Dunphy, who was one of my childhood heroes. I mean, I grew up just loving Don Dunphy. So
Don's a great guy.
Very bittersweet. Very bittersweet.
Yeah, that had to be very weird.
Very, yeah, completely. And we both work with his son now, who's a great friend. And yeah, I mean, I remember, you know, many nights with the transistor radio pressed to my ears, Don Dunphy call fights. So he was God, you know.
And another great voice of boxing like Barry is Jimmy Lennon Jr., the great ring announcer. He recounts to us a moment at the Greg Haugen and Julio Cesar Chavez fight in which Don King got kind of emotional.
Oh, that was a special event. The numbers range from 120 to 135,000 on that, but you never know. But it was, you know, purportedly the largest crowd ever to pay for a fight, the largest attendance. Yeah, you know, that particular fight was a special moment, not only because of the size of the crowd, but the setting where, you know, we're in a soccer stadium, Estadio Azteca, and there's a moat between the ground and the stands with German shepherds and guards in the moat, keeping the two, you know, the two separate. You know, people were, I would look up into the arena and people had little fires. They were cooking their food because they'd been there since noon. And I mean, it was a celebration like you can't believe. And, you know, I tell this story, forgive me if you've heard it, but I was in the ring with Don King, and it was just he and I before the main event. And they had a laser light show and a music show, and it was high quality, really well done, and kind of emotional music. And this event was coming up. And I looked at Don King, and I'm telling you the truth, he had like little misty eyes. He was like, you know, really moved by this. And then later I thought maybe he was counting the crowd and the proceeds from all the seats and realizing what he was getting, and that was moving him more than anything else. But, you know, it was an amazing moment. And, you know, doing it in English and Spanish was a little bit of a challenge. And you know, it was just great. But, you know, the bigger the crowd, in a way, the easier it is for me because they're excited. They feed off I feed off of their excitement. And so, it was a great experience.
Well, we continue looking back at some of the great stories that have been told to us here on this show. And one of them was by the brilliant broadcaster, Tim Ryan, who explained to us how he did the radio broadcast for the first Ali Frazier fight.
I had been doing a few fights on Mutual Radio. And Jack Price was a man who ran the broadcast division at Madison Square Garden at the time. And he tipped me off that there was an issue when the Ali Frazier fight had been booked into at the Garden in New York, that the television rights that were owned by Jerry Perencio, who was a big cable TV guy, and Jack Kent Cook, they went on years later to own a number of sports franchises and so on. That what they had not gotten done was to make sure that the World Heavyweight Championship radio feed was going to the Armed Forces Network, which was a tradition of many, many centuries, not centuries, decades in the US. And at the last minute, they realized that that was the case, and they had some pay-per-view screenings at some Army bases. So they kind of thought they had that covered. That created an instant controversy just a few days before the fight. So they were pressured by a story in the New York Times to make sure that the fight broadcast was delivered to the Armed Forces Network. Well, they had to set that up quickly. There was no announcers assigned, and it turned out because I had been hired at the last minute by the New Zealand Radio Broadcasting Network to be their announcer because they couldn't afford to send one from New Zealand to New York. So, and I looked up and down when I got there at the end of this long story. I'm sorry, but there was a row of radio announcers from all around the world, but I was the only English-speaking one. And they wouldn't take the TV feed, of course. That was Don Dunphy as the play-by-play. And so it came to me, they said, well, we need somebody to allow the feed to go to the Armed Forces Network. Could we take your feed that's going to New Zealand? And they don't have any money, the Armed Forces Network. I said, are you kidding me? I wouldn't take a nickel from the Armed Forces Radio Network. I am thrilled and honored to have my voice go out and call a heavyweight championship fight. So that's how it occurred, and I remember it all to this day. You make the point about the garden itself and what a spectacle it was. I said there was every kind of person dressed in every kind of way, men and women, in that building, all of the celebrities and so on. It's unmatched even now in terms of how huge that fight was.
Well, if the Ali Frazier fight was iconic, which it certainly was, there was another iconic moment in boxing that my buddy Antonio Tarver was involved in. When he fought Roy Jones Jr. the second time after losing a very close decision to him the first time, when they got to the center of the ring, Antonio said to Roy Jones Jr., Roy, what's your excuse going to be this time? Here's the genesis of how that came about.
I'm going to give you another little nugget, Al. At the time, I had a great friend of mine, Charles Muniz, who was working as my manager agent. Yeah. And in the hotel room, Charles Muniz brought that to my attention. And it kind of dared me to say it, you know. and I didn't know I was going to say it, Al, until I got in the ring at that time. But he made sure I remembered that if I was going to say it, I better have said it then. And I don't know why I said it. It was just one of those things that I felt that that's what the fight meant to me.
Yeah.
That whatever happened after we touched these gloves, you know, whether I get knocked out, whether he get knocked out, but we're going to go down in history. And I just felt that, Al. I just felt that it was going to be a special moment. I didn't know how it would end up. I knew that I trained to win. I trained to be successful that night. I actually trained to knock Roy Jones out because I didn't think I could win a decision.
Yeah.
And I think that edge, knowing I had to do more in that training camp, really pushed me to places that I didn't even think I can reach.
I think that every fan and every boxing observer was so taken with the audacity of what you did at that moment and the way you did it with such conviction. Here's a question. Do you think it had, I mean, of course, Roy Jones Jr. is one moment is not going to turn a fight,
define his career,
you think
right?
He was shocked that you did it?
He had to be a little bit, I mean, taken back. I don't know how long it lasted on his mind. I don't know.
The fight didn't last very long.
Right. That wasn't my intention, but I just wanted to make a statement. And I think the statement was made.
Well, I hope you're enjoying, as I am, looking back at some of these video clips from the great guests that we've had here on Al Bernstein Unplugged. And I want to remind you that we have some great guests upcoming, including Claressa Shields, the great women's boxing champion, David Benavides, former 168-pound title holder, and the great Snoop Dogg, not only a terrific rapper, but also a man who's very involved now in the sport of boxing. Now, one of the people you've already heard from on this show, Jimmy Lennon Jr., of course, had a famous dad, Jimmy Lennon Sr., who was one of the great ring announcers of all time. And in this clip, Jimmy tells us about the time Mike Tyson did something very special for his dad.
Yeah, it's a heartwarming story that was very, very special. It occurred that actually the day after his second fight with Razor Ruddock. And I got a phone call and someone said, Jimmy, there's a white limousine outside of your dad's house. In there is Mike Tyson and Tommy Hearns. And they're coming to see your dad. Now, at that time, my dad was pretty sick and he was close to death. And so I ran there, I got there, and there was Mike Tyson and Tommy Hearns at the door, and they sat down at my dad in his chair, and he was wearing a robe and not looking so great. And especially Mike Tyson could not have been more polite and sweet and dear. And he sat lower than my father, like down on a little footstool. And he looked up at my dad and asked him questions about wrestling and boxing and just shared his heart with him. Gave my dad more months to live. And it was just an amazing, touching moment for my dad and all of us to see. And it showed the heart of Mike Tyson. He's a sweet man in so many ways.
A heartwarming story indeed, and it kind of demonstrates that none of us are defined singularly by the one piece of information that is supposed to explain us. And Mike Tyson, a more nuanced individual than some people might anticipate. That story was emotional, but emotional in a different way. Is a story that Christy Martin told us. Of course, Christy is a famous women's boxer from years gone by. She's in the Boxing Hall of Fame. And while she won titles in the ring, outside the ring, she led a harrowing life. Her husband, Jim Martin, tortured her, tormented her, and ultimately tried to kill her. She recounts some of that terror.
As I went back that day, and Jim had been telling me for 20 years, if ever I left him, that he would kill me. And when I went back home that day, I knew that that's what was going to happen. He was going to kill me. But I was to that point in my life that, number one, it really didn't matter. I was that low. It didn't matter to me if I lived or died. And basically I was ready to die. So, but also I was never going to be that person that lived looking over my shoulder the entire time. Waiting for him to attack me or shoot me or kill me or whatever. I just couldn't be that person. In my mind, I had to go that day back to my house and either live through or die with whatever he had to give out. And that's what happened. I mean, by the grace of God, somewhere during the middle of the attack, and the attack actually lasted about 45 minutes, the switch flipped. And instead of not caring if I lived or died, no, I told him, in very blunt words, you can't kill me. And I meant it as much as I meant that, as much as the sun came up this morning, I meant you cannot kill me. And that's just the way I felt it. And as I said, by the grace of God, I'm still here. And I feel that God left me here to help other people that are in the same kind of circumstances that I was in for so long.
So I hope you enjoyed that look back at some of those stories. The idea of Larry Merchant and Don Dunphy at ringside, coming to blows, as Barry Tompkins said. That one caught me, that made me slightly aghast. Barry told me, he's told me that story on a number of occasions, and he said when he looked down and saw that, he was like, okay, now I've seen everything. So that was pretty crazy.
Well, let's get to
so we have a lot of questions, do we not?
We do. Well, let's get right to it. Iceman John Scully says, when are we going to force elimination of regular emeritus silver champions?
Yeah, John Scully, by the way, for people that may not know, John was a terrific amateur champion and a very good professional fighter. I announced a number of his fights. He's a terrific, terrific guy. He also works with the USA Amateur Program, the Alumni Association, which I also do work with, and helps connect many amateur fighters that over the years would lose sight of each other. And And he's just a remarkable guy and knows boxing better than just about anybody. And so his question, is the ultimate one. I don't know anybody other than the people that are running the boxing organizations that understand why you would want a interim champion, a champion in emeritus, a champion in recess, a silver champion. I mean, I could go on and on and on. They come up with all these crazy titles, and then you end up with a, 4 champions in one weight division. It's ludicrous. I mean, ludicrous is the only word you can use to describe it. Now, I'll tell you what I almost understood in the old days. And being an NABF champion, which was a North American Boxing Federation champion, the reason I can understand that maybe is you know that's a stepping stone championship that you've won that tells you you're on your way to being a world champion, and it's designed to be a regional kind of, title that nobody's saying you're a world champion. So those titles are absurd. It is one of the things that is farcical in the sport of boxing. And, boxing is in many ways the noblest of sports, and in some ways it's the most ridiculous. And that is one of the parts that's the most ridiculous.
Okay. Rick D. Michelle says, if you could see any fighter from the past 30 years go against any pre-1990 fighter, what would your matchup be?
It's a great question. I think I would go, I'm going to pick Manny Pacquiao as my post-1990 fighter. Of course, he's been a tremendous champion for a couple of decades. And I'm going to take the Manny Pacquiao that fought around the featherweight division, and that was where he had all his great fights with people like Marco Antonio Barrera and Juan Manuel Marquez and Eric Morales. And those 4 created what I think of as another version of the 4 Kings, except at a lower weight class. They were tremendous. And I'm going to take him and send him back in time to face the great Salvador Sanchez, who was a great featherweight champion in the late 70s, early 80s, and was a brilliant fighter who unfortunately passed away at the age of 23 because of a car accident. And at that point already, at age 23, he had already beaten, I think, 4 fighters who would go on to be in the Boxing Hall of Fame. He was undefeated. He had been in some of the most wildly exciting fights that anyone has seen, and was just a spectacular fighter. Now, I think Salvador Sanchez was going to have about another 5 or 6 or 7 year run in which he was going to create a resume that would have been almost unrivaled. Now, I do believe that because of the nature of his fights, they were all action affairs, and the fact that he fought such tough guys, I don't know if he would have gotten much past age 30 as a top fighter. But those 7 more years would have cemented a legacy that would have made him one of the greatest ever. And as it is, people think of him as one of the greatest ever. So Manny Pacquiao and Salvador Sanchez, and how would that fight go? It would be a pitched battle. And I think ultimately I would probably pick Salvador Sanchez to win by a split decision or a close decision. And the big question, right, Trip, would be, would you have it be 15 rounds like Salvador Sanchez used to fight? Or would you have it be 12 rounds as Pacquiao fights in his era? That'd be a key question.
Yeah, and by and large, you've been in favor of knocking fights, and it's been a long time now, but you feel that 12 rounds is much better for the athletes themselves.
Generally, I think it's probably a more humane way to go about it. However, many of the boxers I talk to, they point out that 15 rounds is what separates, the men from the boys. And I've seen so many fights that would have ended up differently had it gone 15. But in general, probably the move to 12 rounds makes sense.
And a question for a future show that I'm going to write in on would be very interesting. I know you're not big on lists, but to have the fighters who left well before their time, and kind of a list of some of the greats that's careers we were not able to see because of circumstances, and that would be very interesting.
Oh yeah, that's true. Fighters that, well, you could look at it, and sometimes fighters their careers were cut short. Whether it's, we just talked about one in which unfortunately passed away due to a car crash, and then people that have had other issues that have made their careers shorter than they would have liked to have seen, and that we would have liked to have seen.
Sure. So Amanda writes, did any commentators from your past inspire your commentating style?
Interesting. Not so much, but not because I don't hold them in great regard. It's just that I was forced to kind of make a new style of boxing commentating, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, you have a play-by-play announcer and you have the color commentator. And I started out doing color commentary on Showtime, but I came on and I wasn't a trainer. I wasn't a famous boxer. I had boxed as an amateur, but nobody knew about me boxing as an amateur. I was, in effect, a journalist who came on doing color commentary about boxing. There had been almost none to that point that had been that kind of person coming on to do color commentator in boxing. There may have been someone, but I don't know if no one I can think of. So what did I have to do? I had to create this way of doing it. I had to, of course, do commentary on what was happening and try and add analysis. But I also had to, I thought, put in anecdotal material and informational material to show my worth. Why should anybody listen to me early on in my career? I wasn't famous. I wasn't a well-known boxer. I wasn't a trainer. I had to earn their respect by talking about the fight, but I felt I had to do something more. And because of that, I kind of created what went on to be the style of other broadcasters, the journalist / color analyst. Larry Merchant had filled that role, had started filling that role at HBO, though he didn't really do that much announcing during the fights. At that point, during the actual match, he didn't do that much. So I was the first one that announced all the time during the match. So I couldn't look at Gil Clancy or Angelo Dundee or some of the fighters that had been commentators. I couldn't say I want to take my style from you, because that wasn't me. Now, the place where I did get influences from other announcers is when I started doing play-by-play. About 3 or 4 years into my career, I started doing play-by-play on boxing. Now, for that endeavor, I looked to the great Don Dunphy, who, of course, was my idol. And I also took pieces of Barry Tompkins, Sam Rosen, Sal Marciano, Steve Albert, a number of people early in my career that I worked with, and I utilized that to help me.
Yeah, and just on a personal level, when I would do blow-by-blow with you, you were great prior to a fight to say, brevity, get in, get out. No one's here to hear a blow-by. Maybe on radio it's a different story, but when you're doing a fight blow-by-blow on television, you're not. It's not about you. It's about the fighters.
Yeah, you have a couple of responsibilities. You're there to talk about the action that's going on. You're there to give some informational material to remind people during the fight who's who, and maybe give some biographical stuff that will help them remember who they are. And then you're there to chronicle the event and guide the ship. That's what you do. And when I did play-by-play, I had to be very careful not to veer into being the analyst, because I'd been the analyst. And so I had to constantly remind myself, okay, don't add on that extra comment about why he's using that left hook so much. That's not your job on this show. That's the analyst's job. So even though you could do it, don't do it.
And when you made the shift from color to play-by-play or blow-by-blow, as we say in boxing, was it more, did you find that people talking in your ear became more of a factor? Was it annoying? How do you react to that, the director and the truck?
I just think that when you do that, when you do analysis on a show, you still are going to hear the producer talking to you, but you're not getting the specific instructions like you are when you're doing play-by-play or you're hosting. And so you had to get used to the idea that they were going to be telling you all those things. And I had, since I got involved with it pretty early in my career, I was able to adapt to that pretty well. So I was probably the first analyst on ESPN that ever did play-by-play. I enjoyed doing it.
Which do you prefer?
That's a good question. I guess I like them both equally. The analyst role is what it kind of made my career. But I really love doing play-by-play. I think it's fascinating, and I love the idea of being able to paint a picture, a word picture, and punctuate something exciting that happens. So I maybe equally. It's hard to pick one really over the other.
And if you look at all sports, I can't think of any other example of a color analyst who's gone over to play-by-play, though it's happened in baseball on radio. There are a few players who become very good play-by-play. But other football, basketball, I can't think of any.
Not too many. There have been a few, like there have been some. Frank Gifford did on football.
That's right.
And
Good. Yeah. Yep.
Also, the broadcaster he played with the Cardinals and was I'm blanking on his name from St. Louis.
Yeah, the catcher. Yeah.
Yeah, Tim McCarver, but also the football player from St. Louis. There's been some that have done that, and I think it's probably happened a little bit in recent times, but it doesn't happen that often. Not too often. So I was proud of that. I actually felt good about that because I thought that was a kind of a feather in my cap that I was able to do that. But once in a while, people will be able to make the transition. Who did it very well? Chris Marlowe, who was a world-class volleyball player, who went over to do play-by-play in volleyball and basketball, and Chris did a great job on that. So he was an example.
Yeah, we've become a sports media podcast, but when you'd mentioned Roone Arledge, who was the father of so much in sports the way we see him today, at one point, he was the president of ABC Sports, known throughout the world. And then he got a job as the president of ABC News, and someone said, what difference is it going to make? And a wise scribe said, now he'll have two offices he's never in.
Yeah.
I got a kick out of that.
Yeah, true. Yeah, he was remarkable. Amazing experience. Do we have any more questions left, or are we out?
We have one more, and it's about one of the guys classic here. What are your memories do you have of Leon Spinks? I'm a huge wrestling fan, and I barely found out that he did a couple wrestling matches. That came from Quarantine Club.
Yeah, he did. Leon Spinks passed away, and just passed away, and Leon, a delightful man. He lived out here in Las Vegas in the latter years. His wife, delightfully sweet woman. I spent a lot of time around them in recent years at different boxing events, especially with the Nevada Boxing Hall of Fame and other events at the International Boxing Hall of Fame and many other special boxing events. He was always a delight, a good guy, despite some of the problems he faced in life. His attitude toward life was a great one. And I covered his fight when he fought Larry Holmes. The only other, he had the win against Ali, then lost Ali, and the only other world championship fight he had was against Larry Holmes in Detroit, and I covered that one for SportsCenter and spent a lot of time with him leading up to that fight. We did a feature in which I was with their camp for several days, and that I really found him to be ingratiating and an interesting guy, and he suffered from some health issues as time went on, and and of course, sometimes people forget that he won a gold medal at the Olympic Games. We talk about him as a professional, but winning a gold medal at the Olympic Games is a forever achievement. And he was able to do that. And of course, he became the heavyweight champion after only his 8th fight as a pro. So pretty extraordinary. And I found Leon to be just a delightful, delightful man. And he'll be missed. We all really enjoyed him. So our condolences to his wife and the whole Spinks family. And I was able to cover his son Corey's fights. I announced Corey's fights against Zab Judah and a number of his son's fights. So I had a lot to do with the Spinks family. Well, our friend Tom Yankello merits a mention because he is, of course, a great boxing teacher and historian in a way, because a lot of the material that's on his world-class boxing channel has to do with how fighters approach the sport. And so go over to World Class Boxing and check out Tom's channel, and you can see a lot of great information there. We have some really good guests coming up. Claressa Shields is going to be our next guest, and she's getting ready for a fight in March. We're still on board to have Snoop Dogg visit with us. That's going to happen any week now. We're also going to talk with David Benavides, who's got a fight coming up in March. And I will next be in action on television on February 20th when Adrian Broner steps into the ring in the main event. And we also have Brazil versus Valine, a heavyweight matchup. And that should be a fun card. So my thanks to you, Trip, for your fine efforts, as always.
Enjoyed it. We get great questions. Please continue to send your questions in, and this has been fun to get through a bunch of questions today.
Yeah, today we got to answer a lot of them, so I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time. Take care.